I've always been cautious, or at least I thought I was. I'm not someone who takes risks. In fact, I think of myself as overly careful. So, when I bought my small beach house in South Carolina, I never imagined that something truly terrifying could happen to me there. The house was supposed to be my little escape, a retreat from the stresses of life up north in Massachusetts. I'd worked hard to get it, and though it wasn't luxurious, a simple 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, it was mine. It was quiet and peaceful, a perfect getaway. Of course, it was too expensive to let sit empty when I wasn't using it, so I listed it on Airbnb. I rented it out when I wasn't there, which brought in a little extra money to cover the mortgage. I kept the master bedroom for myself, locked it with a deadbolt, and made only the 2 guest rooms available to renters. It was an easy setup, and things went smoothly for the most part. People came, enjoyed the beach, left. No problems. But that changed one chilly spring night, and I still can't shake the feeling that something darker could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. Let me tell you what happened. It's been months now, but I still replay it in my mind, over and over. It started like any other trip down to the house. The plan was simple: drive the 16 hours from Massachusetts, get to the house late at night, sleep, and spend a few days relaxing. I hadn't been down in a while, and the house had been rented pretty consistently, including right up until the day before I arrived. The last tenant was a guy named Eddie, who booked the place for 3 nights. He'd messaged me a couple of times, friendly enough, said he was bringing his fiancée down for a little vacation. Asked for restaurant recommendations, said he wanted something local. You know, typical Airbnb small talk. After Eddie checked out, I didn't bother hiring my usual cleaning service. It's not that I'm cheap, but I figured I'd get in, clean it myself, and save a few bucks. I like to check the house thoroughly after guests leave anyway, make sure nothing's damaged or missing. So, after the long drive, I rolled into town around 10 p.m. I was exhausted, like the kind of tired where you can barely think straight. I just wanted to get inside and collapse into bed. I pulled up to the house, unloaded my bags, and unlocked the door. You know that feeling when something's off? Like you don't see anything out of place, but the air feels wrong? That's what hit me the second I stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet, and there was this strange, musty smell, like someone had been there, but they shouldn't have been. But I brushed it off, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. I didn't even bother checking the rest of the house. I just went straight to the master bedroom, unlocked it, and collapsed onto the bed. I must have fallen asleep instantly because the next thing I remember is waking up, completely alert. It was around 11:30 p.m. At first, I didn't know what woke me up, but I felt this wave of anxiety, like something was terribly wrong. My heart was pounding, and every instinct told me to get up and check the house. I forced myself out of bed, grabbed my phone, and started walking through the rooms. Everything looked normal. The living room was as I left it, the kitchen was clean, and the guest rooms seemed untouched. Well, mostly untouched. The bed in the larger guest room looked a little disturbed, like someone had sat on it recently, but nothing too alarming. Still, something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been, or still was, inside the house. So, I pulled up the footage from the porch camera I had installed a while back. I watched it on my phone as I stood there in the middle of the kitchen. The footage showed Eddie arriving 3 days earlier, just like he was supposed to, but there was no fiancé. He was alone. He had clearly lied about that. But here's the creepy part. There was no footage of him leaving. None. He had entered the house, but as far as the camera showed, he never left. My stomach dropped. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned, missed something. Or maybe, Eddie was still inside the house. At that point, I didn't care how tired I was. I went through every closet, checked under the beds, behind the curtains. Nothing. But when I reached the master bedroom, the one room that should have been untouched, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom, the door I had left open, clicked shut behind me. It wasn't a breeze. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone gently pushing the door closed. My throat tightened. I crouched down and peered through the small crack at the bottom of the door. I don't know what I expected to see, maybe just shadows, but no. There were feet. 2 feet standing just a couple of feet away from the door. Someone was inside my bedroom. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. The adrenaline was kicking in, and I didn't know what to do. The only thing that came to mind was to grab a weapon, something to protect myself. So, I went to the kitchen, opened the drawer where I keep my carving knife. The drawer was empty. The knife was gone. At that moment I panicked. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I bolted out the front door and ran to my car, locking myself inside. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived faster than I expected, and I explained everything to them. They didn't seem too alarmed at first, probably used to dealing with overreacting tourists. But I insisted that something wasn't right. One of the officers pulled out his flashlight, and they went inside to search the house. I stayed outside, watching from a distance. After a few minutes, one of the officers came out and waved me over. I walked in, heart pounding, and there, sitting calmly in the living room, was Eddie. He was just sitting there. No knife in his hands, no sign of a struggle, just sitting like he belonged there. When the police asked him what he was doing, he shrugged and said he just needed a place to stay for one more night. He acted like it was no big deal, like he hadn't been creeping around my house with a stolen knife. The police didn't seem too concerned. They told Eddie to leave and advised me to sort it out with Airbnb. They didn't arrest him, didn't even search him. They just let him walk out the door. And as for the knife? It was back in the kitchen drawer, neatly placed where it should have been. I was in shock. None of it made sense. Why hadn't Eddie left when he was supposed to? Why lie about the fiancé? And where was he hiding for the 3 days between his checkout and my arrival? The police couldn't, or wouldn't, give me any answers. They told me it was just a misunderstanding and left me standing in the house, alone. I changed the lock code immediately and messaged Airbnb to report Eddie. They banned him from the platform, but that was it. No compensation, no real explanation. I was left to deal with the mess on my own, and to this day, I don't know what Eddie's real intentions were. All I know is that I came far too close to danger in what was supposed to be my safe space, my home. That night changed everything for me. I used to love going to that beach house, but now, every time I step through the door, I feel uneasy, like someone's still watching me. Like I'm not alone. Maybe I never was. I still can't shake the feeling of dread that's been following me since that weekend. I know people say it's silly to dwell on things that are over and done with, but this felt different. I don't know, maybe talking about it will help me put it behind me. Or maybe it'll just confirm that I'll never be able to forget what happened. It all started a couple of months ago. I'm Matt, by the way. I'm 26, still living at home with my parents, which wasn't part of my grand plan. But life has a funny way of turning things upside down, doesn't it? I've been in a bit of a rough patch lately, struggling to find stable work, dealing with a breakup that never fully healed, and just feeling stuck. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had been on and off for a while. She was never quite sure if I was committed enough to anything, my career, our relationship, even just making plans for the future. Maybe she was right. I figured what I needed more than anything was some space. A chance to clear my head, get away from everything for a weekend. So I rented this small, one-bedroom cabin on Airbnb, just outside Troutdale, Virginia. It seemed perfect, remote, quiet, nestled deep in the woods. Just me, a few hiking trails, and some time to think. I told my parents, and of course, my mom worried like she always does. Emily was even more skeptical. A solo trip? Why not just invite me along? She'd asked when I told her. I don't know how to explain it, but I needed to be alone. I think she took it personally, but it wasn't about her. Not really. So I packed light, just a backpack, my laptop, and a few clothes, and drove the 2.5 hours out to the cabin. The drive was actually nice. The further I got from the city, the more I could feel some of the weight lifting off my chest. I remember thinking, this is going to be good for me. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, but cozy, with a rustic charm. There were woods all around, thick and dense. The air smelled different out there, fresh and clean. I found the key under the mat, just like the owner had told me in the message, and let myself in. The inside was simple, wooden walls, a small kitchen, and a fireplace that gave the place a warm glow. It felt safe. I dropped my bag and decided to explore the area. There were some trails nearby, and after being stuck in traffic earlier, I needed to stretch my legs. I walked for about an hour, letting the quiet surround me. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustling of animals in the distance. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. On my way back to the cabin, I saw them, 2 men walking along the gravel road that led up to the property. They didn't look like hikers though. They weren't dressed for it, and they didn't have the relaxed, aimless energy of people just out for a stroll. These guys seemed focused. I was driving back in my car by this point, and when I passed them, I gave a casual wave. You know, just being polite. They didn't wave back. They didn't even smile. Just cold, blank stares as I drove by. That feeling I had, the one that told me I'd made the right choice coming out here, it started to crack, just a little. When I got back to the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about those guys. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe they lived around here or were just passing through. Still, something about the way they looked at me stuck in my mind. I brushed it off and made myself some dinner. As the sun went down, the woods took on a different vibe. It wasn't as comforting in the dark. I locked the door and lit the fireplace, trying to create some atmosphere, reading a book I'd brought. But that's when I saw them again, through the window, just outside the cabin. 2 figures running into the woods. My stomach dropped. Were those the same guys from earlier? Why were they here? I grabbed my phone and messaged the Airbnb owner, trying not to sound too paranoid. Hey, I saw some people running into the woods near the property. Is that normal around here? A few minutes later, the owner responded. Probably just local kids messing around. They hang out in the area sometimes. Nothing to worry about. That didn't really make me feel better. Kids? Those guys didn't look like teenagers. Still, I tried to focus on my book, telling myself I was overreacting. After all, nothing had happened, right? But the uneasiness stuck with me, so around 9 p.m., I decided to make a quick trip to the nearest Walmart. It was about 20 minutes away, and I figured picking up some extra snacks and supplies would help settle my nerves. As I drove, the gravel roads were pitch black. No streetlights, no signs of life, just me, my headlights, and the darkness closing in on either side. It was eerie. I remember feeling like I wasn't really alone, even though I couldn't see anyone else. After grabbing what I needed, I headed back to the cabin. The drive felt even longer this time. I couldn't shake the thought of those men, wondering if they were still out there. When I finally got back, I locked the door behind me and tried to relax. I had just sat down with my book again when the lights flickered, then went out completely. The only light left was from the fireplace. Great. I messaged the owner again, and he told me the circuit breaker was outside, near a telephone pole behind the cabin. The thought of going out there, alone, in the dark, no thanks. I decided to just deal with it. I could manage one night without power. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. It came from near the bathroom. My heart started pounding. I stood up, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then I saw him. Standing in the doorway, dimly lit by the flickering firelight, was a man. He was tall, looming, with broad shoulders and a hood pulled low over his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me. For a moment neither of us moved. My mind raced. How had he gotten in? The door was locked, "Don't move," he said in a low, steady voice. "I don't want to hurt you. Just stay calm and give me what you have." I froze. Everything in my body screamed to run, but I couldn't. I could barely speak. "All I have is my laptop, some clothes, and a little cash," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "Get your wallet," he ordered. I didn't argue. I emptied it out, maybe $60 total, and handed it to him. "Now go to the kitchen," he said. Again I obeyed. I walked slowly, trying to keep my hands steady as I moved. I heard the front door open, then close. I waited, listening for any other sounds. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I finally got the courage to peek out. He was gone, but so were my backpack, laptop, and the cash. My hands were shaking as I called 911. I told the dispatcher what had happened, describing the man and the two guys I'd seen earlier. The police showed up about 20 minutes later, but by then, it was too late. They took my statement, promised to keep an eye out, but they didn't seem optimistic. "These kinds of things are hard to track," one of the officers said. After they left, I messaged the Airbnb owner again, hoping for some kind of reassurance. At first, he seemed sympathetic, but when I brought up the idea of a refund, he got defensive. Said it wasn't his fault and that he couldn't be responsible for what happens in the area. That stung. Not only had I been robbed, but now I was out the money for the cabin, too. But the worst part, I couldn't shake the feeling that the owner knew more than he was letting on. How else would that guy have gotten inside? I was sure I'd locked the door. And those two men I'd seen earlier, what if they were in on it? What if the whole thing had been a setup? The more I thought about it, the more suspicious it all seemed. That weekend was supposed to be an escape, a chance to clear my head. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. I didn't lose much in terms of valuables, but the experience left a mark on me. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure standing in the doorway, and I can't help but wonder, was it just a random robbery? Or was I being watched from the moment I arrived? I don't think I'll ever really know. But one thing's for sure, I'm never going back to Troutdale. So, this was supposed to be a celebratory trip. We had just graduated high school, and a few of us decided to rent an Airbnb cabin up in New Hampshire, near the White Mountains, to unwind. It was me, Ethan, who's been my best friend since middle school, his girlfriend Madison, my friend Rachel, and Savannah, a girl I'd grown pretty close with during senior year. We'd rented this cabin in Carroll, which is just a small town near the mountains. It was a great deal, like shockingly cheap for what looked like a beautiful, isolated cabin in the woods. Savannah found it online and convinced us it would be perfect for our getaway. It had everything: a big living room, a hot tub, a fireplace, and even a rec room with a pool table. The only weird thing was that there was this rundown old shed right next to the house, which wasn't in any of the pictures on the listing. But Savannah joked that it was probably the reason the cabin was so cheap, and we all laughed it off. The drive up there was cramped. 5 people crammed into Ethan's little Hyundai Accent for a 4-hour drive. By the time we got there, it was already dusk. The cabin itself was gorgeous, like something out of a postcard, big, with wooden beams and large windows, and surrounded by dense woods. But that shed, that thing was creepy. It was small, barely standing, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it was caving in. I remember Rachel making a face when she saw it and saying, "This looks like something out of a horror movie." I just laughed, though deep down, it gave me the creeps. We unpacked and settled in. The layout of the cabin was great, except for one thing. One of the bedrooms had a door that led directly outside and faced that old shed. Savannah, who was supposed to sleep in there, flat out refused. "There's no way I'm sleeping with a view of that thing," she said. So, we rearranged the sleeping situation. Ethan and Madison took the master bedroom, Rachel took one of the other rooms, and Savannah and I ended up on the pull-out couch in the living room. After settling in, we all grabbed some beers, yeah, We weren't exactly legal yet, but who wasn't bending the rules at that age? And headed to the hot tub in the rec room. It was nice, sitting there with my friends, the warmth of the water, and the cool mountain air coming through the open windows. We were laughing, sharing stories, and Ethan kept teasing me about Savannah, hinting that something romantic might happen between us on this trip. It was all in good fun, but it did get me thinking about her a little differently. It was around 2 a.m. when the night took a strange turn. After a few drinks, Savannah, Rachel, and I decided to go out on the deck to stargaze. It was beautiful out there, clear skies, more stars than I'd ever seen. The cabin was far enough from town that there was no light pollution, and for a while, we just lay there in silence, soaking in the stillness. Then we heard it. At first, it was faint, like the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. But it was steady, and it was coming closer. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a deer. There were plenty of animals in the area. But then the footsteps got louder. Heavier. Deliberate. Something big was walking toward us, and it was coming from the direction of that damned shed. Rachel sat up, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my heart starting to race. "It's probably just a fox or something." But I didn't believe that. I could tell by the weight of those footsteps that it was bigger than any fox. I grabbed Savannah's hand and stood up. "Let's go inside," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't want to freak them out, but I was definitely freaked out. We went back inside, locked the door behind us, and sat in the living room. Savannah was looking at me, clearly shaken. "Do you think someone's out there?" she asked. "Nah," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember?" We eventually went to bed, but I barely slept that night. Every creak and gust of wind had me on edge, thinking that at any moment someone, or something, might be outside that door. The next morning, over breakfast, everyone seemed to have forgotten about the footsteps from the night before. Everyone except Savannah. She looked tense, like she hadn't slept either. After we ate, we headed out to hike Mount Washington and check out the Flume Gorge. It was a great day, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On the drive back to the cabin, Savannah brought up the shed. "We should check it out," she said suddenly. "No way," I replied. "It's probably just full of junk. Why bother?" "Come on," she insisted. "In daylight it's not so creepy. I just want to see what's inside." I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed to go with her. The others opted to stay inside and relax while we ventured over to the shed. It was even more rundown up close. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were so dirty you couldn't see through them. I pushed the door open, and it let out this awful creak. Inside there wasn't much: a rocking chair, old tools, and rusted doorknobs scattered around. But the weirdest thing was the smell. It reeked of stale cigarette smoke, even though there was no sign anyone had been in there for years. "I told you, it's nothing," I said, but Savannah just stood there, staring at the rocking chair. "Someone's been in here recently," she murmured, pointing at the floor. There were fresh cigarette butts scattered around. We left after that, neither of us saying much, but I could tell she was still uneasy. I was too. That evening, we decided to make a campfire outside. It was our last night at the cabin, and we wanted to enjoy it. We sat around, telling stories, roasting marshmallows. For a while, it was peaceful. The sky was dark, and the woods around us were pitch black. Then, from the tree line, we heard the footsteps again. This time, they were fast, like someone, or something, was running toward us. "What the hell?" Ethan stood up, holding his beer. "Do you hear that?" Before any of us could respond, there was this flash of green light. It was so bright it lit up the entire backyard for a split second. We all froze. And then, from the woods, came this sound. I don't even know how to describe it. It was this horrible, high-pitched scream. At first, it sounded almost like a siren, but then it turned into something much more terrifying, like the scream of a wounded animal. Madison screamed and bolted for the house, and the rest of us weren't far behind her. In the panic, I knocked Rachel over but stopped to help her up. Ethan was already at the door, holding a can of bear spray, waving it around like it would actually help if whatever was out there decided to attack us. Just before I reached the door, I turned back. In the dim light of the fire, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was hunched over, draped in what looked like a cloak or blanket. I couldn't make out its face, but it was watching us. "Get inside!" I yelled at Ethan, shoving him toward the door. We slammed it shut and locked it. Madison was already on the phone with the police. When the officer arrived, he searched the area with a flashlight but found nothing. He said the green flash was probably a transformer blowing or lightning hitting a power line. But the figure? The scream? He brushed it off, said it was likely a fish or cat, small, vicious animals that make terrifying sounds. But Madison insisted she saw a man, hunched over, draped in something. The officer didn't seem convinced, but I knew what I saw. That was enough for us. We packed up our things and left that night. None of us wanted to stay another minute in that cabin. Since then, I've avoided going back to the White Mountains. Every now and then, I'll think about that night, and I'll get this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what we saw or what was stalking us, but I know one thing for sure, it wasn't a fish or cat. Something was out there, watching us. And whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. It was late October when I decided to take a weekend trip out to a small town just outside of Portland. Life in the city had been too much lately, work deadlines, the never-ending noise, and the constant rush. I needed to escape, just for a few days, to somewhere quiet where I could clear my head. So, when I came across this rustic cabin listed on Airbnb, it seemed like the perfect spot. Nestled in the middle of a wooded area, the cabin was charming yet isolated, promising peace and tranquility. The listing had plenty of 5-star reviews, most praising the serenity and the fact that it was far removed from civilization. I was sold. I booked the cabin, packed up my car, and headed out on a Friday afternoon, excited about the prospect of 2 days of solitude. The drive out was scenic, trees bursting with autumn colors, the sun casting long shadows as it began to dip below the horizon. It was nearly dark by the time I reached the turnoff from the main road. The narrow gravel path leading up to the cabin was surrounded by dense forest. I could barely see beyond the headlights of my car. The road seemed to go on forever, with no signs of life. I began to feel a little uneasy, but I shook it off, reminding myself this was what I wanted, peace and quiet, away from everything. After about 10 minutes of driving down that desolate road, the cabin finally came into view. It was exactly as the pictures had shown, a small, rustic house with a wooden porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and a fire pit in the front yard. It looked cozy, but in the dim light, there was something slightly off about it. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that I hadn't seen another house or person for miles. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the door. The key was supposed to be in a lockbox by the side of the door, and sure enough, it was there. The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I was greeted by an eerie silence. Not the kind of comforting silence I had hoped for, but the kind that felt unnatural. The kind that makes your skin crawl, like the world around you is holding its breath. The interior of the cabin was modest but clean. A small kitchen, a living room with an old couch and a fireplace, and a set of stairs leading up to what I assumed was the bedroom. Everything seemed to be in order, but I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I settled in, unpacked, and made myself a quick dinner from the groceries I'd brought along. As the night wore on, that uneasy feeling continued to creep over me. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, that had been mentioned in the listing, and I had initially welcomed the idea of being completely disconnected. But now, with the darkness surrounding the cabin and the oppressive quiet, I started to feel vulnerable. I decided to make a fire. At least the warmth and light would make things feel a little more comfortable. I found some wood stacked outside, brought it in, and got the fire going. The crackling flames did help, for a while, casting a warm glow around the room. I grabbed a book and settled into the couch, trying to relax. But after about an hour, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I heard a noise outside, just a faint rustling at first, like the sound of leaves being disturbed. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the noise grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving around the cabin. I sat up straight, my heart beginning to race. I walked over to the window and peered outside, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the small circle of light coming from the fire inside. The woods were pitch black. I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps had stopped, but my nerves were on edge now. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just a deer or some other animal passing by. Still, I couldn't relax. I double-checked that all the doors were locked and closed the curtains, trying to block out the unsettling darkness outside. That's when I noticed something strange. In the corner of the living room, near the fireplace, there was an old, heavy chest. I hadn't really paid much attention to it when I first arrived, but now, standing there in the dim light, it caught my eye. The chest was closed, but something about it felt out of place. I don't know why, but I had the sudden, irrational urge to open it. I knelt down beside the chest and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, it was mostly empty, except for one thing, a small, handwritten note placed carefully in the center. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. The note was brief, scrawled in messy handwriting that looked rushed. It read, "If you hear them, don't open the door. No matter what you do, don't let them in." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the note. Who had left this here? And who or what, was it referring to? Before I had time to process what I had just read, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. My heart felt like it stopped for a moment. I glanced at my phone, hoping for service, but of course, there was none. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. Instinctively, I backed away from the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? And why would they knock so calmly, almost casually, in a place where no one was supposed to be? Suddenly, the note in my hand felt heavier. "Don't open the door." I stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stood there, my breath shallow, heart pounding, my eyes fixed on the door as if I could somehow see through it. The third knock echoed through the small cabin, more deliberate, but still calm. I felt a strange mix of fear and confusion. This wasn't how intruders acted, right? Shouldn't they be more aggressive? Yet, the calmness of those knocks, in the silence of the night, felt far more unsettling. I clenched the note in my hand, the words echoing in my mind. "Don't open the door." Whoever had written it had been in this cabin before, clearly sensing something was wrong, just as I was now. I took a few shaky steps backward, keeping my eyes locked on the door. My instinct screamed to follow the warning, but a part of me, the part desperate for an explanation, wanted to see who was out there. A fourth knock. This time it was different, more insistent. But still not threatening. Whoever was on the other side wasn't banging on the door, wasn't shouting nor demanding anything. It was unnerving because it didn't make sense. Why would anyone come to a remote cabin, in the dead of night, knocking like they had all the time in the world? I couldn't stay frozen in fear forever. I grabbed my phone again, hoping against hope that maybe by some miracle I'd gotten a signal, but nothing. The screen just showed, "No service," mocking me. I considered my options. I could stay locked inside, hoping they would just go away, or I could try to confront them. But if I opened the door, the note's warning still gnawed at me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. I listened intently, straining to hear any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything, but there was nothing. My eyes darted to the windows, but all I could see was my own reflection against the dark glass. Whoever had been out there was either gone or waiting for me to make the next move. I crept closer to the door, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door, trying to catch any noise from the other side. Still nothing. The stillness made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like the entire world outside had gone quiet, like whatever had knocked wasn't just outside my door, but surrounding the entire cabin. Then, as if to mock my brief sense of relief, I heard a faint scraping sound. It wasn't coming from the door, though. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, scanning the room, but nothing seemed out of place. The fire was still crackling softly, the cabin exactly as it had been when I first arrived. But that noise, it was unmistakable. It was the sound of something being dragged along the floor, slow and methodical. My eyes fell on the chest again, the one where I'd found the note. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't quite pin down. Was something inside it? Had I missed something when I opened it earlier? I approached the chest cautiously, my pulse quickening with every step. As I got closer, the scraping sound stopped abruptly. I stared at the chest, half expecting it to move on its own. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for what? I wasn't even sure anymore. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I knelt down and opened the chest again. It was empty, just like before. But the moment I lifted the lid, a cold draft seemed to sweep through the cabin, snuffing out the warmth from the fire in an instant. The air felt heavier, like I wasn't alone anymore. I slammed the chest shut and stood up quickly, backing away from it. My mind was playing tricks on me, it had to be. I had spent too much time alone, too much time thinking about that note and the knocks at the door. I needed to calm down. Then, just as I tried to steady my breathing, I heard it. A voice. Barely a whisper, but unmistakably human. "Let me in." It came from right outside the door, a soft, calm voice. It was so quiet that I wasn't even sure if I'd actually heard it. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." A woman's voice. Gentle, almost pleading, but there was something off about it. Something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I had the sudden, terrifying realization that whoever was out there knew I was alone. Knew I was listening. Knew that I was afraid. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath. The voice came again, this time closer. Almost as if she was leaning right against the door. "Please! Let me in." I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my mouth dry as I tried to keep my breathing quiet. She knocked again, soft, deliberate. Not a single hint of impatience. Whoever she was, she had all the time in the world. The voice was almost soothing now, trying to lure me in, to make me think that opening the door would be the safe thing to do. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Then I heard something that sent a cold chill through my entire body. "Don't open the door." But this time, it wasn't a voice from outside. It was a whisper, right behind me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. I was alone. Completely alone. The fire was nothing but embers now, casting faint, flickering shadows around the room. The voice outside persisted, gentle, coaxing. "Just open the door. Please!" I could barely think straight anymore. My mind was racing, flooded with fear, and the isolation of this place was sinking in deeper than ever. I had never felt more vulnerable. The cabin that had seemed so inviting now felt like a trap. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound of the woman's voice. But it was no use. It was inside my head now, echoing louder and louder. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The voice, the knocking, it was all gone. Silence fell again, but this time, it felt different. Heavier. Like the eye of a storm. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By the time morning came, I packed up my things and left that cabin without looking back. I didn't care about the refund. I didn't care about anything but getting the hell out of there. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. But one thing is certain, sometimes, the quietest places hold the darkest secrets. I've always been a fan of solo trips. There's something freeing about being on your own schedule, seeing what you want to see, and just being alone with your thoughts in a completely new environment. So, when I got a week off from work, I decided to rent an Airbnb in a small town I'd never heard of in rural Washington. Quiet, peaceful, exactly what I needed. The place I found looked perfect, a quaint little cabin tucked into the woods, about 20 minutes outside of the nearest town. The pictures showed a cozy interior with wooden floors, a large stone fireplace, and windows overlooking a dense forest. The host, a man named John, had great reviews, polite, responsive, and the kind of guy who didn't hover. I booked it immediately. The day I arrived, the weather was overcast. Clouds hung low, casting everything in a grayish hue, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. I pulled up to the cabin, and immediately something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The cabin looked just like the photos, maybe a bit more worn around the edges, but nothing alarming. Still, there was this strange, heavy silence that settled over the place. No birds, no rustling in the woods, just complete stillness. I shook it off. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I wasn't going to let a little uneasiness ruin it. When I stepped inside, the cabin was exactly as expected, cozy but simple. A big stone fireplace dominated one wall, the furniture was rustic and comfortable, and the windows offered a view of the thick woods that surrounded the place. It was peaceful. The kind of place where you could just disappear for a few days and forget the world existed. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk to explore the area. The host had left a small map of the nearby trails, so I picked one that looped around a small lake about a mile from the cabin. The trail was beautiful, moss-covered trees, the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves, and the occasional trickle of water from unseen streams. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt myself relax. As I approached the lake, I noticed something strange. There was a small, dilapidated shack by the water's edge. It hadn't been mentioned in the Airbnb listing, and it wasn't marked on the map John had provided. Curious, I wandered closer, but the closer I got, the more uneasy I became. The shack was in bad shape, windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges, and there was an odd smell, like something had been left to rot inside. I peered through one of the broken windows. It was dark, but I could make out a pile of old furniture, maybe some tools scattered on the floor. But what caught my eye was a strange symbol scratched into the wooden walls. It looked like a circle with jagged lines running through it, like something a kid would carve out of boredom. Still, there was something about it that made me uncomfortable. I pulled back and decided to head back to the cabin. As I walked away, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, as if I were being watched. I forced myself not to look back. When I returned to the cabin, it was already getting dark. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling from the shack and focused on enjoying my night. I lit a fire in the fireplace, opened a bottle of wine, and sat down with my book. The warmth of the fire and the wine helped me relax, and soon enough, I started to feel more at ease. But around midnight, something strange happened. I was half asleep on the couch when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the door. I froze. My mind immediately went to the shack. Could someone be out there? The knocking stopped after a few moments, and everything went silent again. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a tree branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I didn't dare open the door to check. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing little creaks and rustles, every sound amplified by my growing anxiety. By morning, I was exhausted, but I tried to brush off the previous night as just my mind playing tricks on me. I decided to spend the day in town, hoping to distract myself. The town was small, just a few shops and a diner, but it was charming in a way that reminded me of an old movie. I had breakfast at the diner and struck up a conversation with the waitress, a friendly woman named Sarah. I mentioned the cabin, and her face immediately changed. "You're staying at John's place?" she asked, her voice dropping a bit. "Yeah, why?" She hesitated for a moment, then leaned in closer. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you should be careful up there. There's been stories about that place." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of stories?" She shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Just strange things. People hearing noises, seeing things that don't make sense. A couple of people have left in the middle of the night because they felt like they were being watched." I tried to laugh it off, but my unease was growing. "That's just local gossip, right?" "Maybe," she said, her expression unreadable. "But just be careful, okay?" I nodded and thanked her for the warning, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. I spent the rest of the day wandering around the town, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get the image of that shack out of my mind. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky had grown darker, and the woods seemed even more oppressive than before. I decided to cook dinner, hoping a good meal and a glass of wine would help me relax. But as night fell, the uneasiness returned. I found myself constantly glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the tree line. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. And then, just like the night before, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The knocking was louder this time, sharp and deliberate. I shot up from the couch, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the door. Someone was out there. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't a tree branch, or the wind. It came again, 3 precise knocks. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to fling open the door and confront whoever, or whatever, was there. But the more rational part of my brain screamed at me to stay put. There was no way I was opening that door. Not after everything that had happened. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 11:47 p.m. There were no texts, no missed calls. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That someone was knocking on my door? In the middle of the woods, that could be anything. Another guest lost, a neighbor, even some dumb kids playing a prank. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The knocking stopped after a few moments, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement outside, footsteps, rustling, anything, but there was nothing. Just dead silence. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, gripping my phone tightly. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was over. Whoever it was had left. I slowly backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to jump out at me. But the cabin was still, the fire in the hearth crackling softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I told myself I was overreacting. I just needed to calm down. I poured myself another glass of wine, sat down on the couch, and tried to focus on the book I'd been reading. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to the knocking. The rhythmic, deliberate sound of it. Suddenly, I realized I had left the back door unlocked. Panic surged through me, and I leapt to my feet, my wine glass clattering to the floor. The back door, how could I have been so careless? Anyone could have gotten in. I raced to the kitchen, where the door led out to a small deck. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. But when I pulled the door open, my breath caught in my throat. There was a footprint. A single, muddy footprint right outside the door, pointed toward the cabin as if someone had been standing there, watching, deciding whether or not to come inside. It was fresh, wet mud still clung to the wood, dripping slightly from the tread. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my pulse racing. My mind was spinning with questions. Who had been outside? Why hadn't they knocked at the back door? And what the hell did they want? I tried to calm myself down, but my thoughts were racing too fast. I couldn't stay here. Not another night. I didn't care if I looked paranoid or ridiculous. I needed to leave. Now. I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my suitcase, and started throwing clothes into it, my hands trembling. But just as I was zipping it up, I heard a noise. A low creak, like the sound of weight shifting on the wooden porch outside. I froze. It was followed by another creak, and then another, each one louder than the last. Someone was walking on the porch. Slowly, deliberately, as if they were trying not to be heard but weren't quite succeeding. I tiptoed to the bedroom window, careful to stay out of sight. Peeking through the curtains, I could just make out a figure standing on the porch in the dim light from the cabin's windows. They were facing the door, standing completely still. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, shadowy silhouette. For a few agonizing moments, they didn't move. Then, they slowly reached for the door handle. I felt a surge of panic. They were going to try to get in. Before I could think, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice shook as I whispered into the phone, explaining that someone was on my porch, trying to get into the cabin. The operator told me to stay calm, to stay on the line, and that they were dispatching a unit, but it would take at least 20 minutes for them to reach me. 20 minutes. That was an eternity. The figure jiggled the door handle, testing it, but thankfully it was locked. After what felt like an eternity, they seemed to give up and stepped back. I held my breath, watching, praying they would leave. But then, they did something that chilled me to my core. They crouched down, and I realized they were looking through the window next to the door. I scrambled backward, out of sight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I heard the figure move again, and the creaking of the porch faded. Were they leaving? I waited, straining to hear any further sounds, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. I stayed huddled in the corner of the bedroom for what felt like hours, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Every little sound made me jump, the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, my own breathing. Finally, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. I peeked through the window and saw the red and blue lights of a sheriff's car approaching the cabin. Relief flooded through me. I rushed to the front door, still shaking, and unlocked it. The deputy was a middle-aged man, his face lined with concern as he approached the porch. I quickly explained everything, about the knocking, the footprint, the figure on the porch. He listened intently, his eyes scanning the area around the cabin. "We'll take a look around," he said, motioning to his partner. "But I'd suggest you don't stay here tonight." I didn't need to be told twice. As the deputies checked the perimeter of the cabin, I threw the rest of my things into my bag and hurried to my car. I didn't care where I ended up, I just needed to get far away from that place. Before I left, the deputy came back to the porch. "We didn't find anyone," he said, his brow furrowed. "But we did find more footprints. They circled the cabin a few times, and then they just stopped. Like whoever it was disappeared into the woods." I felt sick. "Be careful," the deputy added, giving me a small, concerned smile. "You never know who might be out here." I nodded, muttered a quick thanks, and drove away, my heart still pounding in my chest. As I left the cabin behind, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow, slipping between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that cabin.